Hello and welcome to the Global Perspective Show. I'm John Bercia, Special Assistant to the President for Global Perspectives at the University of Central Florida. Our guest today is Dr. Alan Zelicoff, a medical doctor who's written a book called Microbe, Are We Ready for the Next Plague? Thank you, Dr. Zelicoff, for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be here, John.
Tell us a little bit about the book, and then we'll get into some other issues that I think will be of interest to our audience.
The book came about largely as an effort to educate the lay public on infectious disease threats that occur in both the human and animal population, but of course the emphasis is on the human population, and how lucky we've actually been in dodging bullets over the past decade or so. We used to think that bad infectious diseases, diseases that were either economically disruptive or caused a lot of mortality in the human population, would come along perhaps once a decade. And what's become clear, largely as a result of the pioneering work of a fellow by the name of Joshua Lederberg, a Nobel Prize winner who unfortunately died last year, was that emerging diseases, diseases that either have never been described before or diseases that we thought had disappeared, are becoming a more profound problem. And as a general rule of thumb, they're diseases that are eminently preventable if we can detect them early, but are very, very difficult to deal with if, heaven forbid, they take root in the human population. So that was the objective of the book.
Now, why is this happening? Is it because of human-caused reasons? Is it because of other things that are happening in terms of climate and the environment? Why are we seeing an upswing in this threat?
It's clearly complex. It includes all of the things you've named, but as to how much influence each of those things you've named, why, that's of course the grist for a lot of research and debate. It's clear that humans are encroaching in areas where we've never encroached before, perhaps engaging in behaviors that we've never engaged in before. So among other things, what's clear is that organisms that seem to have been largely limited to animal populations in the wild are now entering the human population. And it happens even in the United States. So everybody, of course, is familiar with the horrific disease Ebola in Africa, which is probably circulating among bats, occasionally gets into primates, and sometimes primates are hunted and consumed for food in Africa, and that of course may lead to introduction of Ebola into a human population. But few people realize that we've had similar kinds of similar kinds of episodes in the United States. For example, in my home state of New Mexico in 1993, we had the sudden onset of a respiratory disease that was fatal in apparently all of the people that were initially infected, and its origin was a complete mystery. It turns out the organism is now known. It's called hantavirus. Has been circulating among small rodents in North America probably ever since they came across the Bering Strait land bridge many thousands of years ago. And we simply didn't recognize the disease until it became so prevalent that it was impossible to ignore.
How did it make the move from the rodents into humans?
Well, in the case of Hanta, which is an extraordinarily important object lesson for how well public health and the medical community can work together, it just so happened that in that year the rodent population exploded because there was a very wet year in the Southwest, and so vegetation on which the rodents depended was abundant. The rodents became more abundant, and they had more contact with humans, particularly in the northwestern portions of New Mexico. And it literally was a result of the rodents urinating, and that when they do so, they happen to spray their urine in a aerosol that's perfectly sized to get all the way down into the human respiratory tract, down into the end of the respiratory tract, and it caused a horrible pneumonia. And but for the fact that New Mexico happened to be a resource center for the study of mammalogy, and a very heads-up physician who recognized that something unusual was going on among some patients he was seeing, we probably would have missed it yet again. But as a result of what turned out to be a truly collaboration at its best between the medical community, the public health community, and researchers at the university, we were able to identify and isolate the virus within about a month. And because the behavior of the rodent was recognized, it tends to come into people's homes in the evening or night when they're asleep, that we could give people good public health advice about avoiding having contact with these rodents. And in particular, on the Navajo reservation, where some of the cases, by no means all of them, but some of the cases manifested, we could advise people not to sleep on the floor, which is traditionally done, and that immediately knocked down the number of cases. It was really remarkable.
The treatment was avoidance of the rodent?
Exactly. We do think we now have an antiviral drug that may be helpful, but what you'd like to do is to prevent this disease, because when it manifests, it's truly awful.
And you said everyone, or virtually everyone who contracted it, died?
Certainly in the early going, that's right, yeah. We now think the mortality from hantavirus is somewhere around 50% with the use of antiviral drugs and advanced, very advanced intensive care unit techniques, but 50% is hardly acceptable. You'd like to have 0% exposure to start off with. And we now understand the biology of this virus. Interesting thing was that when the virus was identified, researchers actually went back and looked at stored serum from people over the past 40 years who had died from unexplained respiratory disease. And it turns out that hantavirus has been with us at least since the 1950s as a disease. We just never recognized it.
Now, we in this community and many communities around the country are especially interested in and concerned about flu at this time of year. Tell us what you think the risks are from the seasonal flu to the H1N1 strain.
Well, isn't it amazing? The most common infectious disease worldwide, and I really can't give you a good answer as to what the risks are. The risks are in what we don't know. And it's not because we haven't been trying, but it's a very, very unusual virus. What makes influenza different than practically anything is that it's a multi-species disease. So it's really a disease of birds that occasionally gets into mammals, pigs, horses, occasionally dogs, even whales get influenza, and of course humans. Now, the virus is made up of genetic material that for some reason is broken up into individual strands. There are 8 of them in the most common version of influenza called influenza A. And there's nothing that says that a particular host, you, me, a pig, perhaps a bird, can't be co-infected with 2 different strains of influenza at the same time. Now, you remember from high school biology that a virus, by definition, can only reproduce if it finds its way into a host cell. If it sits on a table or sits in a test tube, nothing happens. It has to literally take over the metabolic machinery of the cell in order to reproduce. Well, there's nothing that says that a host can't be co-infected at the same time with 2 different viruses, 2 different influenza viruses. And when the virus is reproduced inside of a cell, their genetic material, of course, is reproduced. And when they reassemble into a new virus particle before they pop out of the surface of the cell, why statistics alone, by chance, would tell you that some number of strands of this genetic material can come from one strain, and another set of strands can come from another strain, and out may pop a new version of influenza that has new either pathogenic, meaning disease-causing potentials, may have an extended host range, or may cause very different symptoms than what we've seen before. So the bottom line is we have a virus that as a group are highly communicable among a wide variety of species. Those species can be exposed to multiple strains at the same time. And so what we worry about, and what we occasionally see in a completely unpredictable way, there's no periodicity to this at all, the emergence of a new strain to which we either have no immunity because we've not seen this particular strain before, or a strain that has unusual disease-causing properties, as happened, for example, in 1918. That's the big concern with influenza, is that it is constantly undergoing mutation and, on occasion, may infect, a single animal may be infected, or a human even can be infected by two different strains, and out may pop a totally new strain with characteristics that we've never seen before.
So when we talk about getting the vaccination for the flu, for the seasonal flu, and then now the H1N1, that isn't going to guarantee you protection against everything. It's just going to protect you against certain types of influenza. So there are some people who think, oh, I got the one and now the other, and I'm fine for the season.
That's right. First of all, let me comment. It's remarkable how well the CDC does in making a determination as to what is likely to be the most prevalent circulating seasonal influenza. And I'm referring to seasonal influenza. I'm talking about the kind of influenza that we expect more or less every winter in either the northern or the southern hemisphere. And yeah, occasionally the CDC and the World Health Organization get it wrong, but what's remarkable is how often they get it right. Because again, it's a very complex ecology with regard to the virus, and selecting the strain for the vaccine that is most likely to be similar to the strains that are in fact realized is no small sleight of hand. There's a lot of intellect that goes into that. Now, with regard to the new strain that everyone is talking about, the pandemic H1N1, and by the way, pandemic literally comes from the Greek pandemos, everywhere there are people. So it doesn't necessarily refer to the severity of illness, although of course we pay a lot more attention when there's a prevalent illness that also happens to be very severe. With regard to the new H1N1, this is one of those events that no one could have predicted. Probably came about, in fact almost certainly came about, as a reassortment of genetic material in an animal that was co-infected with 2, perhaps even 3 different strains of influenza, or 2 different animals that were co-infected with 2 different strains that recombined, and out came this new version of influenza. And so responding to this is difficult, because the time from the recognition of the original cases until the disease starts to spread is very short. If the Mexico example, for example, from last spring is any indication whatsoever, the first case can appear in a human, and within a week you have hundreds, if not thousands, of cases, because it is a highly communicable disease. Now, people often wonder why it's difficult to get vaccine. Part of the reason is that we continue to depend on a technique for making vaccine that depends on growing the virus up in chicken eggs. Perhaps that will change as a result of the experience with H1N1. But also, when you isolate the virus, you're only part of the way towards solving the problem of making the vaccine. You have to get the virus to grow in a culture medium where you can isolate it in large amounts, so that you can strip off the surface materials that are used to make the vaccine. That's, again, a difficult process, one that has to go through many quality control steps. And so getting vaccine from the time of recognition is no mean trick.
Mm-hmm. So how do you feel about where we are vis-a-vis H1N1 currently, and especially in light of what you've talked about with experience with this in other parts of the world?
It's very important to not try to second guess or Monday morning quarterback what public health authorities around the world have tried to do. They work very, very hard with extraordinarily limited resources. I think none of us are completely satisfied with the availability of vaccine at this stage. Here we are in the early weeks of November. Seasonal flu has not yet arrived. We might not even see it. For reasons we don't understand, it appears to have completely disappeared for all intents and purposes in the southern hemisphere that just got done with its seasonal winter flu.
Oh, is that because it's being crowded out by H1N1, or is there something else at play here?
Well, of course, the explanation that it's being crowded out is touted, but what's the mechanism by which that's happened? And I don't think we fully understand that. I certainly don't feel like I understand it. I've been trying very hard to understand it. But it may simply be that the existing flu, I'm sorry, the pandemic flu is far more transmissible, and it may engender an immune response that in some way also affects the survivability of the seasonal flu virus to the extent that it's circulating at all. But I'm not sure I understand, nor that anyone understands exactly why the seasonal flu has, as you put it correctly, been crowded out. Now, all that said, the virus turned out to be tough to grow. The H1N1 pandemic virus turned out to be a bit tough to grow in chicken eggs. And other techniques are slowly coming on board, but we face regulatory hurdles in the United States from the FDA in getting those vaccines approved. But I'm reasonably optimistic that the lessons learned from this will actually rapidly move ahead the next generation for manufacturing vaccines, which should be much more rapid and probably a lot less expensive than with H1N1.
What other diseases are you concerned about? You've done a lot of work in the area of biological weapons, or potential biological weapons. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, it's a bit of an arcane area, and the threat, while I think it's very real, fortunately has not yet materialized. The number of episodes that you can point to for actual biological weapons attacks are very, very small and may be limited only to the anthrax letter bombs from 2001. So I think it's important to keep it into perspective, and the way I keep it in perspective is to think about the biological weapons problem as a subset of public health infectious disease problems. So to the extent that we can increase the robustness of our public health system for early detection of disease, because most of the biological weapons diseases that are classically thought about are not treatable in general once somebody becomes symptomatic, but are eminently preventable if we can identify cases early, is to try to address the biological weapon system with an approach that will be useful for daily public health use for the more common, I don't want to say mundane, because there's nothing mundane about influenza, but the more common diseases that we have to deal with anyway. And so I focus my research primarily on systems for doing early detection. And literally what we're after is the first cluster. There's a very famous virologist, a man who led the smallpox eradication campaign in the 1960s and 1970s, named D.A. Henderson, who's still around and is a thought leader in the field of biological weapons and biological terrorism, who points out that if we really are ever to deal with this, it's going to be the astute observer. It might be a nurse, it might be a doctor, it might be someone working in student health, who sees a case of a human, or maybe it's an animal in the veterinary world, that presents with an unusual set of signs and symptoms, and either by the severity of the disease or just based on their experience, recognizes that they're dealing with something that's out of the ordinary. And if they can report that in a way that is convenient, then there's a good chance that we can, in fact, forestall the consequences. And that's exactly, by the way, what happened in the hantavirus outbreak that we started talking about.
What is uniquely dangerous about smallpox specifically, relative to all the other problems we could face?
Well, let's be clear. First of all, smallpox has, thank goodness, been eradicated as a naturally occurring disease, and the last case was in the late 1970s in Somalia. But what makes it worrisome is that it spreads very, very easily from person to person, and very few of us have residual immunity from the vaccines that we were given if we're over the age of 45 or 50 when we were kids, and the vaccination, the routine vaccination for smallpox was stopped when the disease was eradicated. So should anyone reintroduce that, and it would be an intentional reintroduction, the likelihood of a laboratory accident is very, very small at the CDC, where the U.S. Maintains its collection of the organism that causes smallpox. But should it be reintroduced via a terrorist event, the consequences would just be enormous. And this has been studied in multiple tabletop exercises. Your viewers can look at an exercise called Dark Winter, just look it up on the internet, where extraordinarily thoughtful people who are true experts in the disease smallpox were presented with a scenario where smallpox was introduced intentionally as a terrorist event. And despite their knowledge and despite the existence in the United States of 300 million doses of a highly reliable, highly purified vaccine, we ran out of luck in that exercise. It spreads very quickly from person to person, and most physicians in practice today weren't around when smallpox was circulating as a naturally occurring illness. So it may well be the case that if it appeared in an emergency room, for example, early on the diagnosis might well be missed.
What is the capacity, though, for delivering a smallpox-laced terrorist weapon in 2009? Because you know, before it was naturally occurring, that was the problem. Now you're saying if it were to return, it would be introduced by humans. But do we have a supply of this weaponized smallpox that would be potentially dangerous to the population?
Well, no, we don't, and it's very careful to understand what the word weaponization means, and it's really contextual. It varies a lot from organism to organism. In the case of smallpox, one could envision a small number of infected humans as the delivery vehicle, shaking hands at airports or passing out literature at a shopping mall. Now, some people point out, of course, that folks with smallpox are so ill that they wouldn't be doing that. But in the early stages of the disease, which manifests typically as lesions in the back of the throat, a person might not be severely ill and certainly wouldn't have necessarily the characteristic rash that would make them easily recognizable as being ill. And so that might be one means by which smallpox could be introduced. And we know from an unfortunate event, one that was only recently discovered, in 1971, there was either an accident with or the intentional dissemination of the variola organism, that's the organism that causes smallpox, on an island in the Aral Sea where the Soviet Union, this is 30 plus years ago, 38 years ago, either tested or had an accident with variola, and it started an outbreak of smallpox in a town several hundred kilometers away because somebody who happened to be going by on a ship breathed in the air when the cloud of variola went overhead and introduced smallpox into her hometown. It just illustrates how easily this could get out of control. What we don't know is where all of the isolates of smallpox, and there probably were many thousands of them kept in refrigerators and freezers all over the world in the 60s and 70s, we simply don't know where those all are. And whether or not a terrorist group or some rogue individual could get their hands on the organism is, of course, problematic.
I think we could probably spend an entire session talking about
Indeed,
this, and maybe we'll have another go at it later on. But for today, Dr. Zelicoff, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a great pleasure to be here. I hope we get a chance to do this again. Thank you, John.
Thank you. And thank you for the Global Perspective Show. I'm John Bercia. We'll see you next time.